How do you name a podcast episode? It's actually a question that's being asked in podcast circles right now, and people aren't sure exactly how to title the episodes themselves. We'll answer that coming up next. Hey there, podcaster. My name is the Shannon, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer. Today's video is powered by, of course, Agora Pulse, and brought to you by my podcast, The Swing Shift Side Hustle. If you're looking to bump a podcast out of your listening rotation, you can put mine in there. Links are all down in the description of this YouTube video if you want to go ahead and go give it a listen. I interview a lot of rock stars as of right now, so I'm having a lot of fun with it, and that's what I think podcasting should be about. It should be about having fun. So today we are talking about how to title the actual episodes of your podcast. This is actually this is a question that was brought up in a couple of different groups on Facebook, and people are confused as to how to really just title their podcast episodes. The reason that this is being brought up is because there are people out there who, I wouldn't say they're gaming the system, but there are people out there who want to get all the organic traffic that they can when someone does a search inside of Google. And when you're trying to game the system as far as getting organic traffic, typically what that means is that you're doing black hat tricks. In other words, that's kind of a web term of saying like you're doing kind of like tricks on the web that just really don't work anymore. And if you're caught doing them, Google and Apple can ding you pretty hard and even ban you sometimes from even using their platforms. So really what you're trying to do is you're just trying to just make a podcast. You don't have to think about all this extra added stuff that is really going to not matter later on down the line. So let's talk about why we are titling our episodes a certain way as opposed to using these black hat strategies, okay? So first, I think we need to talk about the two different types of podcasting episodes that you're going to be creating or that you've already created. The first type is going to be, of course, episodic, and episodic podcasts are going to be really more along the lines of like what you're seeing with Netflix original series episodes, where you're seeing something like, say, Ozarks, and Ozarks is it's like 12 episodes long and it's an hour long, and it tells a really great story. Is it like 12, 15, something like that? Any of these episodes that you see on Netflix really are going to be like 12 to 15, but a season can be anywhere between 12 to 15 episodes. A season could be 26 episodes if you want it to be. It's just really going to be up to you. So it's really going to be more about seasonal, episodic structures inside of how you create your podcast. Then there's the other side of it. There's the more linear, or I guess you could say it's the more chronological format that you're using. It's a podcast that is recorded from, the time that you start, and then just it happens every week. You record it and release a new podcast every week. So one happens every week. And so if people were to go back into your library and they were to see a list of your podcasts, they could see that they were all done in chronological order by date. You're just putting a title in there, and that's about it. Now let's talk about those titles, okay? Now, I know there are podcasters out there that are doing this, and there are podcasters out there that aren't doing this. And really, is there a right answer? Yes and no. It just depends on who you're going to talk to. There are definitely podcast purists out there that say you have to absolutely put the episode title and number in your podcast title because that's really going to help your listener. Whereas there are some people out there just like, you don't need to do that. If they're going to listen, they're going to listen. And I'm kind of like on the fence with the people who are like, if they're going to listen, they're going to listen. So unless the podcast episode, I guess, really has it's maybe split up into two different parts, and we'll get into that hopefully here in a few seconds. But really, ultimately, at the end of the day, how do we title that episode? Well, let's look at it a couple ways, okay? Let's talk about the episodic or the seasonal podcast, all right? These, like I said, are like Netflix, and these probably should have a title that, just get an example, kind of like when you go look at a Netflix episode. What is it titled? You're not really looking for any type of specific keyword optimization that is going to be within that title. It's just going to be titled what it is. Typically, what I like to do with my titles, even if it was episodic or if it was a linear podcast, I would pull a quote from one of my guests and use that as the title of the podcast, because that's typically the best title that you can use that will hopefully grab someone's attention, all right? So for an episodic or seasonal podcast, use a title like a Netflix episode. I mean, it could be one word, it could be two words, it could be a brief sentence. But here's the thing, you don't want to keyword stuff the episode. All right, so you don't want to keyword stuff the title. You don't want to say like, learning how to podcast with podcast expert Shannon Hernandez, radio broadcaster, podcaster, podcast producer. That right there is just keyword stuffing the entire title. And the word has gotten around to Google Google, Apple, and the other platforms saying, like, if you're doing that, then there's the likely chance that your podcast will not be listed. Now, I'm not sure if that's the complete truth, but I do know that there's people who have had troubles with their podcast showing up when the titles have been keyword stuffed. So be very, very careful about keyword stuffing. Just make it a simple title, because all the keywording that you're going to need to be doing is inside of your show notes. That's the most important thing. I will constantly promote the idea that you need to create show notes. I've got a video that is up here that talks about how you can create show notes through transcriptions that will be able to help you out if you are confused, okay? But make sure you're doing show notes, because the density of your show notes are really going to help the podcast listener to discover your podcast, whether they be on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, or even on through Google if you're posting your podcast through your website. So just kind of be aware of that. Now, if we were to go a little bit further with these episodic seasonal podcasts, if you go into something, say like Libsyn or Blueberry, they have a section within the actual platform itself that asks if this podcast is episodic and is it a part of a season. So that's something that you want to look at whenever you go in and you get service. Now, with free services, I don't think that you can do that. You would end up having to probably title out by saying something like E1 S1 or something like that, or S1 E1, season 1 episode 1, and then that fills up the title. And that just, I don't know, I just don't like having that. I like the titles just being the titles themselves, but it's just going to be up to you as to what you feel is going to be right for yourself, all right? So when you go into Libsyn or Blueberry, they're going to have that out for you, list that out for you, and I'll show you real shortly what that looks like inside of the Apple Podcasts app if you haven't checked that out or even seen it, okay? Now let's talk about the linear / I guess you could say chronological radio episode style of podcast. This is your chronological podcast that happens every week. There are no real episodes. You're just doing a podcast every week or every day or whatever, okay? And people can go back and they can see that you've released one every day or every week, okay? Now, the same thing applies for these types of podcasts. You do not want to keyword stuff the title, because that'll just count against you later on down the line. You're going to have to end up changing those titles out anyway. So don't keyword stuff, but make sure that you are titling the podcast based on what that podcast is about. So let's say that you were interviewing me or maybe another podcast guru, and you were to say, learning how to title podcasts with Shannon Hernandez. That would be a title that you would put inside as the podcast title. So that would be easy. Or maybe you could say, learning how to create videos on YouTube for podcasters by Shannon Hernandez, or with Shannon Hernandez. That might be another title, but just don't keyword stuff by keep putting the same word over and over. Definitely Apple and Google are going to pay attention to that, and you'll have to go through and you'll have to change that, okay? Again, I'm going to reiterate, your show notes on this style of podcast, they need to be copious, they need to be descriptive, and they need to have links that are linking back to certain websites. So make sure you're making show notes that are really good quality so people can latch onto them. Think of them as kind of like, again, going back to Netflix. If you ever look at a Netflix episode, what is the episode description all about? Even though those descriptions are really, really small and short, and they're not really requiring any type of discovery because they're on a big platform as it is, you as the podcaster, if you're trying to get discovered, you want to make sure that those show notes are pretty dense and have good quality links and details that you might be talking about inside of the podcast. Now let's take a quick look at a couple of podcasts that I think that are really good examples. So the first one that I want you to check out is called This Nashville Life. And right here you can see when we jump on over to This Nashville Life by Kelleigh Bannen. This is a really good podcast if you're really into music and wanting to know more about the recording industry and the music industry as far as from a country artist is concerned. This is a really good podcast to check out. But Kelleigh has been doing the podcast as a seasonal podcast. And if you look at it on the desktop, it doesn't look really, you can't see that there are episodes, but she does mention it in the podcast that this is an episodic type of podcast. But when you go into the app, you can actually see that there are available seasons for people. Okay, there are available seasons, and Apple is parsing those out. Now, as far as these seasons being parsed out into other platforms, it's not the case. On Google Play and Stitcher, it's not going to show up, and it's not going to show seasonally. But research shows that more people listen to podcasts on Apple devices than anything else. So that's likely where you want to put all of your efforts, or not all of your efforts, but most of your efforts. So kind of kind of cater to the people who are listening via Apple. Now let's check out another podcast, and here's one called "You're Killing Me" by Patrick Renna. This is actually the little boy he was the little catcher in the Sandlot movies. Patrick Renna was Porter, and so he's got his own podcast. And here you can see that this is more of a linear podcast. This doesn't need episode numbers at all. It just got the titles, and you can see there's just some simple titles that are on there that are just one word. So you don't have to really worry about keywording too much. What you really should be worried about is getting your podcast out there and promoting it and making sure people are going in and subscribing and rating and reviewing your podcast, whether it's on Stitcher or Apple Podcasts, or just getting the subscription, getting people to come in and listen to the podcast. That's what I think is the most important thing here. You getting your podcast and promoting it. I do believe I have a video on promoting your podcast. If it's not up here, I'll go ahead and leave it in the description down below for you to check out. There should be a link down there if you need more details. Now, here's the thing. If you're starting this podcasting game for the very first time, and I certainly understand that you may be doing that, but you don't know exactly where to start, make sure you grab my essential equipment guide that is down in the description below, or actually it's on the end screen of this particular video, or I'll leave it on a flyout card right up here on the video, and you can go ahead and download that free guide. And it is the exact equipment that I'm using for my particular podcast, how I create my own podcast. So go check that out. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, make sure you do so. Hit that little bell button, and of course hit the subscribe button if you're on YouTube, and that will go ahead and notify you and let you know whenever I am releasing brand new podcast, or not podcasts. I said this in a previous video, I said podcasts, but I'm releasing new videos every week. So make sure you do that and get notified. It'll show up on your YouTube app, and of course, if you're checking in on YouTube on the desktop, it should show up in your notifications. In the meantime, thank you guys so much for checking out this video. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below. I'll certainly do my best to get back to them as soon as possible. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next week.